What is to become of our society? What's in store for us here in the UK if things continue to go the way they are? Is our society, our previously free and happy society, salvageable? Can we get through the current strife and come out the other end stronger, happier, fairer, richer, and at ease with ourselves and with each other? Can we? Or will we succumb to a never-ending race and culture war in which we will eye each other with, at best, a restrained hostility and at worst, open conflict? Who knows? But this open question has been brought home to me in a subtle, maybe not so subtle way very recently. In a recent video I condemned the open and quite vitriolic racism of an airline passenger towards another in a display of race hostility that I don't think I've ever witnessed firsthand. I mentioned this video to a customer of mine who had just also returned from Barcelona on a different flight, saying how disgusting it was. She hadn't heard about it, but because of my stance on the matter, she felt emboldened to share a not very good joke by a comedian about Tommy Robinson. The joke was something along the lines of, Tommy Robinson says that those people who come here and break laws shouldn't be allowed to stay in Britain. So that must include Tommy Robinson. Hilarious. Like I say, it wasn't a very good joke. But it just brought home to me how polarised our society is on this, and indeed every subject. There's just no room for nuance. Because I'd said in as many words that I didn't like racists, she assumed that I didn't like, or even agree, with Tommy Robinson, which couldn't be further from the truth. Similarly, my defence of the victim in the video, who was not only a woman but an elderly one, and disabled to boot, earned me the insult of being a virtue signalling cuck for my trouble. Another commentator accused me of only pointing out bad behaviour from whites, and ignoring the same from non-whites. I directed him to my video on the Telford rape gangs, among others, but didn't hear from him again. But the point is that battle lines are being drawn, and are being drawn very crudely and with very blunt instruments. And the result is that the extremists on both sides appear to be winning the arguments. I say appear because they are shouting the loudest, accusing anyone in the middle ground of treachery, and by doing so, hoping to get those with more moderate views to abandon their moderation and come over to their side. But the middle ground is where we need to be. The extremists believe that their views are somehow purer, in a way that is true, but it doesn't make their views right. It only makes them easy, or perhaps simple is a better way of looking at it. And simplicity is often a virtue. There is an organisation here in the UK called the Plain English Campaign, which does what it says on the tin. It advocates for plain English wherever possible, in order to take jargon and legalese away from the elites and back into the domain of the common man. And this is good. In this case, simplicity is a virtue. Likewise, I understand that English law, and probably Scottish and Northern Irish law too, has 250,000 pieces of legislation. And because ignorance of the law is no excuse in law, we've got to know them all. Good luck with that. And our own tax law, on its own, apparently runs to 26,000 pages. I would venture an opinion that perhaps some simplification is badly needed here as well. But in some case, simplicity is not only undesirable, it may also be unachievable. Looking into the near future, as I see it, we broadly have three options for our society, two of which are fairly simple, although they are far from easy, and another which, although more complex and more nuanced, is achievable. They are as follows. Option 1. The continuance of the status quo toward its logical conclusion. This option, if we don't change course, is the most likely. This is the option that will prevail if we do nothing. This is what will happen if we continue to believe that the maintenance of our society is the job of someone else. This is what will happen if we leave this stuff up to government. The unchecked narrative of diversity, inclusiveness and identity politics will expand. The borders will be flung open to allow unchecked immigration, mostly from Africa and the Middle East. The continuing momentum of the furtherance of minority groups over and above the interests of the majority of the indigenous population will continue untrammelled and will be promoted by the mainstream media, local and national government, policy and minority interest lobbying groups. The mantra of combating racism, misogyny, Islamophobia, homophobia and transphobia will ultimately succeed. The continuing preference for anyone in positions of power to be anything other than white, male, middle class and heterosexual will be total. Anybody white, male and heterosexual will therefore have to resign themselves to the lowest positions in society. The reasonable but often misguided aim of direct proportionality of minority groups in positions of power to reflect their actual proportion of society will be forgotten once this has been achieved. The new aim will be for white heterosexual men to be at the very bottom of society as revenge for the historical dominance. The most aggressive minority groups, and guess who they are, will not be satisfied with proportionality and will be emboldened and seek dominance over the majority. The most aggressive will gradually and systematically effectively sideline the less aggressive or less organised and will achieve their hegemony. The interests of women, gay people, the tiny number of transsexual people and all non-Muslim people of colour who had allied themselves with Muslims in their opposition to what they saw as the tyrannical racist patriarchy will briefly flourish. However, their interests will be negated once the new hierarchy is established and all institutions have fallen under the new paradigm. The logical conclusion to this will be the adoption and finally the imposition of Sharia law. At the current rate of striking, this is the most likely outcome. Option 2, the white ethno-state. Option 2 is essentially the obverse of the eventual caliphate above. At some point, the forces striving towards dominance may overreach themselves as they become increasingly confident of their victory. Perhaps one too many rape gang stories will emerge, as if one rape gang story was ever not one too many. Or maybe a terrorist outrage will occur, an event so horrific and so revolting that the usual exhortations of "don't look back in anger," accompanied by pop concerts and candlelit vigils, will finally fall on deaf ears. As people survey the bits of their children and loved ones splattered all over social media sites, rather than being comforted with the usual poignant photographs full of pathos on the front pages of the mainstream newspapers, they may instead react in a way that can only be described as human. Pushed beyond endurance, they may finally respond, not in the hyper-tolerant way that they always have before, but instead seek retribution against those who they deem responsible. There is a tipping point, the precise location or time of which remains unknown, that is likely to trigger a far uglier grassroots level of vigilante violence than we have ever known before, that once it takes hold, the authorities will be unable to control. Open violence will erupt between the adherents of this most aggressive group and the general population, led by those who have always harboured resentments against this group. Once it becomes apparent the authorities are powerless to intervene, they, and not the aggressive minority group, will instead become emboldened. Then the bloodletting from the indigenous side will begin. Places of worship and cultural centres will be the first to be targeted, followed by restaurants, cafes, takeaways and other places of business, before finally attacking taxi drivers in their cabs, individuals in the street and finally families in their homes. It will not be surgical. First it will be Muslims, then anyone who looks like a Muslim. The ignorant will attack Sikhs. The careless will attack Hindus. This is likely to spread to anyone with darker skin. Mixed race couples will be picked out for particular venom, with the white partner subjected to harsher treatment than anyone, carrying with them as they do the taint of treachery. Doubly so if it's the woman who is white. Then all those snowflakes will find out what a tyrannical racist patriarchy really looks like. Mixed race friendships will end, families will be torn apart, with mixed race children forced to inhabit a zombie twilight for their remaining existence. All people of colour who can leave will. All those who can't will build fortress-like ghettos away from the white population, and never the twain shall meet. Then what? A new normal, and apartheid will be established, rigidly enforced, but without recourse to legislation. The social stigma of association, ramped up to 11, will be sufficient to ensure compliance. Whose side are you on will be the mantra. Us or them will be the rule to live by. Because for those consorting with the enemy, they will be considered worse than the enemy. Now for many, the second of these two options will be preferable. For some, it may even be desirable. But for most people, each of these scenarios will be considered nothing less than a nightmare. But there is another way. Option 3. This option not only doesn't include offering up your prepubescent daughter to the local religious leader for circumcision, but it also doesn't include open warfare with your ethnically diverse neighbour with whom you've been on good terms for the last 20 years. It's a path that requires some courage, moral courage mostly, rather than actual physical courage. It requires withstanding the temptation to be racist, as if there were ever a temptation in itself anyway, but to have the moral courage to withstand being labelled a racist. It requires some thinking, not much, since most of the thing that goes into making a civil society has already been done. We just need to look to our forefathers. It requires drawing some lines in the sand, the vigilance to stand by them and the balls to defend them, no matter what. But mostly it requires effort. Again, not much, but more than nothing, which is what most of us have been doing for decades. It requires some engagement, maybe twice a month in something local. If we all did that, we wouldn't be where we are now. We don't have to accept the caliphate, but then neither do we have to have a race war. We don't have to declare war on the religion of peace, We just need to tell those that seek special treatment that they are not special, and that they need to get back in line and obey the bloody rules just like the rest of us. After all, which is harder, to withstand name calling, like racist for instance, or to engage in a fight to the death with your neighbours? But even if, as I believe, we only have to put in a modicum of effort to get what we want, what's more important is that we must be prepared to let those know who presume to rule over us that if necessary, we are prepared to do anything to get it. So get involved. You could start by coming to London on the 9th of December to defend democracy against the Brexit traitors. That'd be a good start. Because that's what being a citizen is. It means treating this country as if we owned it. As if it still belonged to us and not to the political class. This is our country. We're in charge. We need to start behaving like it.